Joining us is Dr. William Rosenberg, professor of political science at Drexel University. He is tweeting at DRB Rosenberg. Bill, welcome back. Thanks for being here this morning.
Good morning.
Wow, a lot going on, obviously, and at a time like this, people are looking at some sort of historical perspective. I know that I've been ruminating, and one of them was on Twitter, a Life magazine cover in 1967. I was growing up in New Jersey, and I remember that there was a picture of a young boy who had been shot, and he was lying on the streets of Newark, and I was thinking, he's my age. And that sticks with me still, these many years later. And you kind of wonder how many times the country is going to rerun, if you will, these episodes.
Absolutely. If we go back in our past, if we just choose some date, let's say in the 1960s, we saw repeated examples of sort of what is transpiring right now, whether it's the Watts riots in 1965, where nearly 4,000 California military people were brought in to suppress disruptions, 34 deaths, $40 million worth of damage, just a terrible situation. You mentioned 1967, and that was a time, again, where the violence just sort of grew, and the unrest, and basically the anger. It ends up that Martin Luther King made a very interesting statement that says, a riot is the language of the unheard. What we're finding today is that we have a confluence of many things happening at the same time. And while it's difficult to disaggregate it, one thing is consistent, that there are a lot of people that are really troubled by what's been happening with police violence, particularly against young black men. And there seems to be no real solution in the near term. We have cities that are basically in almost a war zone type situation. And unlike many other situations like the 1968 Democratic National Convention or other events that had a particular time frame to it, there's not anything that really provides an easy sort of answer of how will this all end. There's not an end point that's near term. These are long-term problems that are going to require long-term solutions.
It seems like it's such a big mountain that nobody wants to try to climb this. On the other hand, there have been suggestions of smaller things to do, and it does seem to me, Bill, although I'm offering an opinion in this case, and I wonder what you think about it, that discussions about the people, there were people who were agitating, evidently, maybe some from the left, maybe some from the right, but the point is still, at the heart of it all, is an issue about the relationship between one segment of our society and the police force. And something about that has to happen so that we may see, trust is not something you can buy and you cannot get it overnight. It has to take some time, but there have to be some procedural changes that would be able to take place. And I've heard some suggestions about that.
Well, I think what we have to recognize is that we have a repetitive series of actions that have taken place for quite a long time. Just a few years ago, we had the Freddie Gray situation in Baltimore. We had the Eric Gardner situation. And then just a couple of months ago, we had the situation in South Carolina where the young man who was simply running down the street was shot by a group of men, one of them a former policeman. In other words, we don't really sort of have a long-term action to sort of go back to what the Kerner Commission talked about in the 1960s of two societies that are separate but unequal. Right now we're seeing many people that are arguing that there are outside agitators, like you said. Reports from New York said that 1 out of every 7 people were not from New York City metropolitan area. But regardless of who they are or where they come from, the question is, how do you get a solution? And I think what we're seeing right now is that in a very positive way, we see many young people, particularly young whites and young blacks, marching together. Many of them, though, not wearing masks. And if you think about the irony of that, just a couple of weeks ago, we saw the streets of New York where no one was on. Now we see them masked with thousands and thousands of people. And I think that's going to create an unfortunate situation not only in New York, but Washington, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, and elsewhere. We have to figure out what to do. And I think that right now we're seeing the president, who is basically not providing sort of a role in trying to tamp down this when he starts talking about having vicious dogs and weapons directed at people that are protesting outside of the White House. Just think back just a couple of years ago, one of the titles that President Obama had was Consoler-in-Chief. Besides being Commander-in-Chief and Chief Legislature and so forth, we have a situation now where the president is fanning a lot of this activity. And in many ways, even though I'm a little uncomfortable in saying this, that there's a political purpose here. It supports a portion of his base, particularly the white nationalists. They're going to use this as an example about why the white nationalists are behaving the way they do in general. And I think that's sort of a terrible situation for our country to be facing.
Speaking of political purpose, again, Dr. William Rosenberg with us, Professor of Political Science at Drexel University. I think about this in the context of the election because this certainly is yet another piece of the big puzzle that will determine how voters vote when we go to the polls 155 days from now, or vote from home, depending on whether the mail-in ballot is available. And it, by the way, does not stop the coronavirus pandemic, and indeed it may actually exacerbate the situation.
Right. Yeah, I think what we're facing is, number one, an acceleration of the number of deaths that are going to happen, but at the same time, the president is likely to argue that, it was these radicals that were taking looting and rioting in the cities that promoted this dramatic increase in infection and death. And I think that's the tactic that the president will use. He'll forget about his lack of action, or he'll forget about just sort of the enormity of the situation around the world, not just in the United States, where the situation with the young man, actually middle-aged, I guess, man, Floyd was murdered by police. The other thing I would just mention also that hasn't come up in our talk right now is how the rest of the world is viewing this. I mean, every day people are tuning into their televisions, whether they're in Egypt, Korea, Russia, or wherever, and they're seeing United States in flames. They're seeing protests and violence just taking place in such a vivid visual way. And I think that many people are failing to realize that that's also a problem not only for us, but how we're perceived around the world.
I have one last thing to add here, Bill, and it's a new poll that's out today from ABC and the Washington Post, which says that nearly 6 in 10 Americans say that the pandemic has obviously caused a lot of harm, but a majority still says controlling the spread is more important than trying to restart the economy. So it seems that we have, and it's pretty close, so it seems, again, we have a divided America even on something as simple as this.
Well, I think that's very true, but I also think that our perceptions about the world around us are very sensitive to changes based upon what transpires. I mean, if you think just a couple of weeks ago, the police were part of the group that were our heroes. They were our first responders, along with firemen, nurses, doctors, and so forth. And because of the events that have transpired in Minnesota recently, there's a sort of an additive process of many violent acts that are just building, and now it's sort of exploded. I mean, if you take a look at my city, Philadelphia, we have a black mayor, we have a very prominent congressman who have come out and basically said this can't go on. We have the former mayor, Mayor Nutter, making the same kind of point. All of them talking about how this is really a dangerous situation and a horrible situation. We do see some examples, though, where the police are not being viewed as a villain. Many places like Camden, New Jersey, or places in Michigan or in other parts of the country, the police are actually marching with the demonstrators. What happens, though, is the day sort of draws to an end. Those peaceful demonstrations that we often see turn into violent confrontations with looting and so forth, and I think that's really what's so troubling because it's not necessarily working towards a solution. It's basically unwinding sort of an unrest that really has to be addressed.
Bill, as always, thank you so much for your perspective. Appreciate you being here.
All right. Well, have a good day.
You too. Dr. William Rosenberg, professor of political science at Drexel University. Some thoughts on what we've been seeing play out across the country, some historical perspective and political perspective on all of this. And that interesting note there about the police have gone from being heroes in some people's eyes in a very short time to being much less than heroes. He is tweeting at DRB Rosenberg, at Dr. B Rosenberg, Rosenberg.